Something very different this week on the Old Frontliners. For the first time on this podcast, we head to Italy and look at one of the lesser-known aspects of the Great War for an English-speaking audience, that war in northern Italy, so often fought up in the mountains. We're joined by Tom Isitt, an author, historian, photographer, who wrote Riding in the Zone Rouge, a fascinating book following a cycle route across the old battlefields in 1919, and who now has recently published the book Thunder in the Mountains, an absolutely stunning work of more than 300 pages, full of amazing detail, excellent maps, which I always love, and jaw-dropping photographs as well. And I hope here we'll discover more about this part of the First World War and perhaps inspire a few of you to explore these battlefields too. So, welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you here because, this is the first time we have discussed this part of the Great War on this podcast. 280 odd episodes. People say to me, you must have covered it all by now, but you and I know that you only begin to scratch the surface with any of these kind of subjects.
Absolutely.
But a lot of people are probably not familiar with this aspect of the Great War, so I thought we'd start with a bit of background to the war in northern Italy, if that's okay. Who was fighting this war in the mountains, and I guess why?
The why is a very good question. Basically, at the beginning of the war, Italy stood on the sidelines. It was in a treaty with the Austro-Hungarians and Germans, but it was purely a defensive treaty. So the Italians said, it's nothing to do with us, we're staying on the sidelines. And basically the Italians were just holding out to see who offered them the best deal to come in on their side. So the Allies came up with the best offer, and in May of 1915, Italy joined forces with the Allies and declared war on Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary were outraged by what they claimed was a betrayal, but they weren't very surprised. Everyone knew that Conrad von Hotzendorf couldn't wait to get to the Italians. So in May of 15, war broke out on the Italian front, and the topography of the Italian front means there's really only a very small place in the whole of the border where troops could have any chance of advancing. Most of the border runs at 2,000 meters above sea level, all along the top of the Italian Alps. So, military operations in that kind of environment is almost impossible. So the entire Italian effort was really focused on the Isonzo river valley, which is near Trieste in the very top right-hand corner of Italy, where it butts up against Slovenia. So that was where almost all of the fighting happened, but they still had to man another 400 miles of front line that ran across the top of the mountains. So that was kind of the situation at the beginning of the war on the Italian front.
And that kind of Dolomites area becomes this kind of strategic line, really, doesn't it? This demarcation between, I guess, Italy, northern Italy, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because, as you say, there's no other route really for them to access Italy but come across that area, and the front line then begins to stabilise in that wide area across the top bit of northern Italy.
Yeah, there was the idea of making a breakthrough in any of those mountain ranges is pure fantasy. Fighting a large-scale battle in the mountains, you just can't do it. You can't amass enough troops in the valleys. They don't have any room for maneuver. You're attacking along a tiny, 2-mile front, and you're overlooked on all sides by enormous mountains. And there are troops on all of those mountains spotting for the artillery. So most of the front line across the top of the mountains, there was no hope of breaking through. So what they generally did was try and make the enemy as uncomfortable as possible and prevent the enemy from moving reserves elsewhere. But an awful lot of that mountain warfare was literally small groups of men fighting up and down vertical mountain walls and performing incredible feats of climbing and fighting, but ultimately it was for no useful purpose. There was no chance of making a breakthrough, so they just had their own little skirmishes, and that went on for 4 years.
And I guess it ties up essentially hundreds of thousands, millions of men from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Italian army over that long period. I mean, the Austro-Hungarian armed forces were incredible, really, in terms of the kind of the broad spectrum of people within it. It wasn't just Austrians and it wasn't just Hungarians, was it?
No, absolutely not. There were Czechs and Poles and Slovenians and Bosnians, and I think the Austro-Hungarian army gets a bit of an unfair rap at times. Their leadership was abysmal, without a shadow of a doubt. But as fighting men, some of them were absolutely fantastic. Particularly the Bosniaks. Everyone was terrified of the Bosniaks. I mean, it was not unknown for non-Bosnian troops to wear fezzes in the trenches to frighten the hell out of the enemy. So, it was a real melange of nations, and of course, they had this problem with communication. There were 11 official languages in the Austro-Hungarian army.
Wow.
And once they'd killed all the officers in Galicia in 1914, then we had the problem, or they had the problem, of officers being drafted in from non-native countries. So communication was impossibly difficult. All the troops had to learn 60 German commands, and German was the language of command. So everyone was supposed to know 60 commands, but anything other than that, it was absolutely hopeless.
Gosh, and on the other side, the Italians. I mean, Italy was a fairly young nation, wasn't it? As a unified nation by then, it'd been kingdoms prior to that. I mean, my Italian history isn't the best, but it kind of goes into this war, like you said, sits on the sidelines and suddenly finds itself up in this incredible battlefield, fighting a modern war.
Yeah, I mean, the Italian army was just as messed up in many ways as the Austro-Hungarians, because although they were all Italian, almost everybody in those days spoke dialect, from where they're from. So you couldn't understand somebody from 100 miles away from where you lived in Italy. So the Italian language was theoretical rather than universal. So there was that problem. And obviously they have outlying islands like Sardinia. So, the Sardo dialect is completely incomprehensible to an Italian even now. So they had communication problems as well. And they also had the problem of conscripted men from Sicily who'd never even seen snow. And they were suddenly finding themselves at 12,000 feet in a blizzard, and they suffered like dogs because none of these guys were used to it. Nobody was used to it. I mean, even the mountain guides who, lived in those parts of the world, they never thought they would have to go up to the top of mountains and fight. They thought it would all happen in the valleys. And an Italian general of the Alpini wrote a report at the beginning of the war that said that normal troops could only fight up to 1,500 meters above sea level. Alpini could fight up to 1,800 meters above sea level, and he was shot by a sniper at 2,300 meters above sea level. So no one knew what was going to happen. And there was this kind of, rather than a race to the sea, as they had on the Western Front, they had a race to the peaks. Mad scramble to get to the top of all of these peaks, because from those peaks you can direct artillery.
I mean, these battlefields, reading your book, the staggering thing is, this is the Great War in the heavens, almost, isn't it? With incredible kind of altitudes. You talk about 8,000, 11 to 12,000 feet above sea level, where much of these actions took place. I mean, I don't think people are aware that combat took place in those kind of environments.
No, it's a very little known fact. And, the difficulties in fighting at 12,000 feet, there's, 40% less oxygen up there. So just walking around, you're exhausted, let alone fighting. Getting food and supplies up to these mountains was incredibly difficult. So they were existing on a very meager diet while physically having to work very, very hard. And it was terribly difficult for them. Most troops could only stand 6 weeks at high altitude before they had to be taken down and effectively taken to hospital in order to recover. So the logistics of fighting at 12,000 feet are mad. When in the Ortles, they dug ice tunnels all the way under the glaciers so that they could go from one sector to another without getting killed by an avalanche or without getting shot. So they're tunneling through glacial ice. They're digging rock tunnels through mountains. There was a huge amount of mine warfare as well. Some truly enormous mines were blown on the Italian front. I think the biggest was 50 tons.
Wow.
And a 50-ton mine going off under limestone because, there's no soil anywhere up there. It's all solid limestone. So if you blast a 50-ton mine under that stuff, one of the mines displaced 320,000 tons of rock. I mean,
Gosh.
that's a colossal quantity. And there's that old joke about Messine, wasn't there, where whoever it was said, we may not make history, but we'll rearrange geography, or words to that effect. And
Yeah.
that's exactly what they did on the Italian front. I think 23 mountains are visibly different now than they were before the war.
That fact alone is a staggering aspect of this conflict in northern Italy. So, I mean, given that this war in Italy is a lesser known part of the First World War, what brought you to this subject and this landscape of conflict?
Like a lot of people, it was my grandfather. While researching my grandfather's First World War record, I found out that he spent the last year of the war on the Italian front, about which I knew absolutely nothing, except that there was a battle at a place called Caporetto, and that had gone very badly wrong for the Italians. But that was literally all I knew about the Italian front. So I bought Thompson's book, The White War, which was the kind of go-to introduction. And the more I read of that, I could not believe what I was reading, and I was absolutely staggered by it. So from there, I thought, well, I better go to Italy and see where my grandfather fought. And in doing so, I rode my bicycle along the length of the Italian front, about 750 miles, visited a lot of incredible places, and I absolutely fell in love. The scenery of the Dolomites, the scenery of northern Italy, the food, the coffee, everything about that visiting experience was so joyful. So I went back many, many times thereafter to different parts of the battlefields. I took up climbing because there were certain places that I wanted to get to that you can't even get to by hiking. So my son and I learned how to rock climb. And we just, I don't know, every time I go there and I stand on the top of one of these mountains, and there is so much left over because none of it was cleared. So you're standing amongst, there are 6-inch howitzers still sitting on top of ridges, and you stand beside one of those things. And for me, it was a very strange experience because there was a real joy in having got to that place, but there's a real sadness about why I've gone to that place and the things that happened in that place. And that was a really unsettling set of emotions for me. The joy and the sadness at the same time were quite strange. And I've never felt like that on the Somme, for instance. The experience of the Western Front battlefields is quite somber. There's not a lot of joy to be had. So that was a strange aspect to my travels.
And is there a kind of stillness in the mountains that you perhaps don't associate with a former battlefield? I mean, I don't know. Is there a different atmosphere there? I guess by the sounds of it, there is.
It's not as melancholy. Some places on the Western Front, every time I go to Verdun, for instance, it's raining and it's the saddest place you can imagine. But on the top of a mountain in the Italian Alps with the sun blazing down and, your boy at your side, it's really difficult to kind of get that same contact, I suppose. As I said, it's quite unnerving and slightly odd. But there is a fantastic stillness, and there's a remoteness. Some places you're dozens and dozens of miles from the nearest road or the nearest person, and so there is I'm quite good on my own. I quite like to kind of be in the landscape on my own and absorb a lot of this stuff. So I find it absolutely magical to be in these beautiful places, staying in mountain refuges. And all of these mountain refuges originally were headquarters in the First World War. So you're staying in a hut with, a dozen other hikers in a building that was the Italian headquarters for the Ortler sector or for the Carnic Alps or whatever. So I absolutely love that. It would be a bit like going to Tok H and spending the night there, I suppose, is the Western Front equivalent. But things like that I find magical.
And when you did your previous book, you cycled across the landscape of Flanders and northern France, which I guess is going to be very different than to doing the same thing in a mountainous region of Italy. So you must have faced some pretty big challenges in doing this journey.
Yeah, physically, the bike ride was very hard. I think I said in the book that it was basically the equivalent of cycling from Oban to the top of Ben Nevis every day for 3 weeks. So physically it was very challenging indeed. There were some days where I massively miscalculated what I was going to be able to do. But there's a joy in it. And I think, as a cyclist, inflicting pain on myself is part of the deal in some respects. So I quite enjoy that. And I took that forward into hiking. I did some enormous hikes, which I halfway through thought, what the hell am I doing? But yeah, it's physical, it's challenging, and that's part of the appeal. I mean, I'm very lucky that I can still do this stuff. And I made a point in my book of listing a load of battlefield walks that people who are not so active could do, because I appreciate that not everybody wants to climb a 12,000-foot mountain.
You mentioned a couple that I think people had unfavourably described as the place for tourists, but you say that you actually think that's quite a good thing because people should have access to these places.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of these reconstructed things. I mean, they're not what I personally love, but I think the way that they introduce the subject to non-specialists, that can be brilliant. Some of the reconstructions are really engaging. And, if I was to turn up there without knowing anything, I would have left an hour later going, oh, that's interesting. So yeah, I'm a fan of those. I don't want to see them everywhere, and I don't necessarily want to go to them more than once, but I think it's important to engage a wider audience if possible.
And I guess beyond those kind of more beaten trails, you must have felt a great sense of discovery as you were doing this, because I mean your book in many respects, the more I read it, the more unique it felt in the way that it tackled these battlefields that most people don't even know exist. So I guess discovery was all part of that journey.
Absolutely. Not only the on the ground discovery, which is fantastic. I mean, there was so much trial and error because there's nothing written in English about these battlefields. So an awful lot of what I was doing was going to a place that I thought might be interesting and there might be something to see. And sometimes there was, and sometimes there wasn't. So there was a lot of turning around and retracing my steps. But it was really exciting to see these places, and also doing the research. In the British language, the Izonzo is really all that gets covered in any detail about the Italian front. And there's very little in English about the Dolomites or the Ortlers or the Carnic Alps. So reading those Italian books, and I don't read English, I translated all of them using Google Translate, which was very laborious, but very exciting because there are all these facts coming out, which, are obviously known to Italian readers, but to the British reader, finding out that there was that there were thousands of female porters carrying stuff up to the front lines, things like that just stopped me in my tracks and made me go, oh my goodness, this is the First World War unlike anything I've experienced or read about before. So yeah, very exciting.
And you begin your journey in the book on that Isonzo front, where there was a staggering number of battles, was it 12 or something like
12,
that?
Yeah.
And you talk about the Carso, the Death's Fortress, I think is what you call it, a wilderness of stones as sharp as knives. I mean, that we haven't even got into the mountains really yet. Already we're seeing some incredible looking battlefields.
Yeah, I mean the Carso is unbelievably bleak and awful. It's a sort of plateau of rolling hills about 400 meters above sea level. It's limestone, so there's no water, there's no topsoil, and it is as the quote goes, a howling wilderness of stones as sharp as knives. And they fought there for 27 months. And you can't get water, so everything has to be brought to that battlefield. You can't bury the dead because there's no topsoil. You can't dig a latrine because there's no topsoil. So, the conditions were beyond awful. In high summer on the Carso, it's 30 degrees and not a stitch of shade anywhere. And in midwinter, the wind blows and it's roundabout freezing. Just, and it's a tiny battlefield. It's a battlefield that's the size of Milton Keynes, and yet 200,000 men died on that battlefield.
Gosh.
It's brutal combat in an unbelievable environment.
I mean, you mentioned in the book as well, it kind of gives you a bit of an insight into command in this war in northern Italy, with how the Italian generals tried to fight that war in a place like that, not very successfully.
No. Well, I mean, the problem with Italian command was that the whole show was run by Luigi Cadorna, and he was a very harsh disciplinarian. He was real old school military. His dad was a general, and so he brought sort of Napoleonic thinking to a mechanized war, and he ruled by fear. So nobody disagreed with him. The people below him ruled by fear, and so it went all the way down the line, and it completely stifled any kind of conversation, any kind of lateral movement or lateral thought. The general said, attack, 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 and that's what they did. And the Italians learnt nothing from the Western Front. The Italians, even by 1917, they still didn't have creeping barrages. Counter battery fire was almost non-existent. It happened more by luck than judgment. In the Battle of Ortigara, a huge battle, only one Austro-Hungarian gunner was killed. I mean, one.
It's kind of unreal, isn't it? It's kind of unreal, these
days. And to be fair to the Italians, while they were neutral, the British and the French, were not telling them anything. We're not giving them any kind of advice in case they joined with Germany. Once they joined with us, they should have learnt, the lessons from the Western Front. But, there's one point where there's a guy, and this is classic not learning from the Western Front, barbed wire happened quite quickly. Everyone knew you needed wire cutters. In Italy, they were using gardening shears because they didn't have wire cutters. And, so the unpreparedness of the Italians was quite terrifying. They'd had nearly a year to learn what was going on and what they might need. And they failed dismally.
And one of the things that I noticed in that section of the book was the story about Gabriele D'Annunzio and the fighting near Hill 28. And you use this as an example to kind of talk about sources and trying to understand this war in Italy and how difficult that is.
Yeah. Research is very, very difficult for the Italian front stuff, particularly from the Italian perspective. The Austrian archives are open, they're online, they're very easy to access, fantastic. The Italian archives are held by the Italian military. So if I want to go and look at the Italian archives, I have to get a letter of accreditation from the British military attaché in Rome. Then I have to book a seat in the library at the archive, which only seats 5 researchers. I can only go once a month and only 3 times in 9 months, or every 3rd Friday of the Monday before, or something like that. I mean, it's just, it's Machiavellian in its complexity. And so effectively for a non-Italian, it's impossible to get to the Italian archives. Even for an Italian, it's very hard. And I suspect there's all sorts of stuff in there they don't want people to know about. I've come across endless examples of Italian colonels just falsifying reports about attacks that never happened. And I think if the Italian archive was put online, I think we would get some very, very disturbing revelations as a result. So it is very difficult, and that example of D'Annunzio, decimating somebody else's regiment, it's just a classic thing. 5 people saw an event, each saw it slightly differently. Then they told it somebody 20 years later who wrote it in a book 20 years after that. So a definitive truth is completely absent.
And I mean, you mentioned that incident with decimation. I was surprised at the kind of brutality of justice in the Italian army, where they are literally decimating units, selecting, 1 in 10 men for execution. And often these guys who might have been decorated for gallantry or done good service elsewhere, but that didn't matter.
No, absolutely. I mean, decimation was so cruel because it was random. You could be a non-participating person in that unit, but you could still get yourself shot. So, decimation was a really horrible thing. I mean, it was outlawed, but that didn't stop Cadorna bringing it back. But I mean, the Austrians were just as awful in their own way. I mean, the Austrians had this thing called binding, which was their equivalent of field punishment number 1. But basically, they tied your hands behind your back and then hoisted you over a beam. So the first thing that happens is you dislocate both your shoulders. And this was commonplace in the Austrian army. They did it to their POWs. The Austrians had thousands of Russian and Serb POWs working for them on the Italian front because they were free labour. The Italians had to do all their own logistics themselves, but the Austrians worked tens of thousands of Russian POWs to death. I think 10,000 Russians died just building the pass over Vrisic in Slovenia. So, yeah, both sides. And the Austrians were, they had a reputation for barbarity and brutality. They, the things they did on the Eastern Front in 1914 just defy belief.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like the rawest of raw combat, really, when it comes to something like the First World War. And one of the things I kind of skipped to in your book, because I was particularly fascinated, is this element of going up into the Dolomites to this highest point, if you like, of these battlefields of the First World War. And I've got to say that part of the book I found absolutely riveting and often quite frightening to see some of the things that you did and where you went. And again, there must have been huge challenges for you getting to these places.
Yeah, I mean, it's... Richard Holmes made me do it. The famous quote about if you want to understand a battlefield, you need to walk the ground. And he's absolutely right. You do ideally want to be standing there looking around you. And experiential historian sounds a bit naff, but I kind of want to try and experience as close to what those men experience as I can. I draw the line at being shot at, but if I'm writing about people climbing mountains, then if I've climbed the same mountain, I can bring a certain amount of experience to it, and I can describe it in a slightly better way than sitting in an archive somewhere. So yeah, I mean, I climbed Clode Rossa on my own. That was a monumentally stupid thing to do. I would never recommend anyone do that. But it got me to a place, an Italian barrack that sits on a ledge at 9,500 feet. And you sit outside that barrack and your legs dangling over 1,000-foot drop, and the clouds are billowing around you, and it's such a powerful emotion. It's such a there's a sense of personal achievement. There's a sense of, oh my goodness, how on earth did they fight a battle up here? And it feels to me like, because I'm climbing on the same rock as some of those men, using the same handholds and the same footholds, it gives me a really close connection to those men. And on Croda Rossa, there were so few of them. There were we're talking about a couple of hundred people. And I feel like I know some of them really well because I've read so many accounts in Italian of these men or by these men, and they all cross-reference each other. And so you get to a point where you kind of feel a sort of familiarity with these men, which I really enjoyed.
I mean, this is the First World War, almost at the very highest point as to where fighting was possible. I mean, what was that war in the mountains like, and how was it even possible, really?
Yeah, I mean, it was because the other side were doing the same thing, you know. So if you didn't get your artillery spotters to the top, then they would have theirs at the top, and they would have an advantage. So there was this kind of creeping up the mountains. Croda Rossa is a particularly good example because you've got a very clear Italian side of the mountain and a very clear Austrian side of the mountain, and they climbed their respective sides to the top. But, you know, they're building huts in these tiny little forks above enormous drops. In November 1916, there were a dozen avalanches in that mountain group. And, you know, a rescue party went out to find somebody that got buried by an avalanche. So another rescue party had to go out and find the first rescue party, which they couldn't, but they found the original people. And so you've got these men literally stumbling about in blizzards, in avalanches, in temperatures down to -40, looking for their friends and their colleagues, just trying to survive. And I think, you know, if you live in a tiny shack at the top of a mountain for months on end, I mean, you either end up hating the people that you're with, or you form a very, very strong bond. And I think it's testament to that bond that those men prepared to go out time and time again to look for their friends, to try and help. I found it really emotional reading those reports because, you know, I just can't imagine myself in that situation. I'd be in my bunk going, "No, I'm not helping. The hell with that." So yeah, and it's inspirational stuff. You know, in amongst all this warfare and misery and awfulness, there are clearly very strong bonds of friendship, and that is also visible in the mountain guides. The mountain guides who worked up at the top of these mountains, they all knew each other before the war. The war came, and they had to join their respective sides, and there are several examples of mountain guides bumping into each other on opposing sides and pretending not to see each other and shuffling off. So, you know, those bonds of friendship, you know, cross language, cross nationality, and I find that, you know, that's a pretty heartwarming stuff, I think.
Because there's a kind of a culture in the Dolomites, isn't there, which kind of crosses the boundaries of language, nationality, you know, national boundaries, and so on, which we see there even today. So I guess it must have been perhaps even stronger then.
I think so, yeah. I mean, even now, you know, the idea that one bit of a mountain is Italian and the other's Austrian is completely alien to the people who live there. You know, they all speak German, even if they're supposed to be Italian. And, you know, that part of the world has always been German speaking, but you do get little pockets of other languages. There are a few valleys in the Dolomites where they speak Ladin, which is a sort of cross between Latin and Romansh, the Swiss language. And it's only spoken in the 4 valleys in the Dolomites, I think. It's now protected by law. And there's a place on the Altopiano where they speak a form of High German that came with traders in the medieval times, and they've spoken it ever since. So for us British, you know, borders are very clear and very solid and very understood, and language is the same. Our language has effectively been the same for 1,000 years. But for people who live in these border areas, it's so fluid. It's so, yeah, you know, they pick up different bits of different languages, and none of them see themselves as Italian or Austrian. They're Tyrolean, and that's how they view themselves even now.
And I guess that war high up in the mountains at times must have felt quite isolating. I mean, they must have felt isolated being up in these high peaks. Did that have an effect on morale and battle fatigue and everything else? I guess it must have done.
Yeah, I mean, there were several aspects to this. You know, some people were very, very out of their depth at high altitude in the mountains. There was a collection of intellectuals from Milan who decided they wanted to be Alpini. So they went up into the high mountains and they just had the worst time imaginable. They realized they were not cut out for that at all. And they ended up being disbanded. But, it's very difficult for a lot of people to put up with being stuck in a shack in a mountain. Snow blindness, mountain sickness, just the greyness of it. I think it's Fritz Weber talks about how, depression became all-consuming because there's nothing to look at. You look out the window and it's just white. And it's like that for weeks on end. And all you do is go outside, shovel a bit of snow, go back inside, play cards, go to sleep. And so that existence for those guys was really grim, really hard work, physically as well as mentally. And mental issues were a significant problem.
And as you describe in the book, it's not just men up on the front line. There's at least one example of a woman serving on the battlefield here as well, although officially not initially a woman, Victor Savis, an 18-year-old Austro-Hungarian member of a Standschutzen.
Yeah, the hero girl of the Dreisinnen. Yeah, she joined up with her father, but she joined up under the name of Victor rather than Victoria. And she was awarded several medals for bravery. Nobody apart from her commanding officer and her father knew that she was a girl. She won a couple of bravery awards, then had her leg blown off, and they took her to hospital and cut her uniform off to discover that she was a girl, which must have come as a bit of a surprise. But yeah, she was quite a famous one. There were one or two others in the Austro-Hungarian army, but not on this front.
And the amazing story where she meets Hitler, who gives her a prosthetic leg, like in the Second World War. I mean, it's just incredible, some of these stories.
Hitler's not funny, but but yeah, she met Hitler and he gave her 125 Reichsmark for a new wooden leg. So there you go.
Incredible. And I mean, you mentioned it before as well. I mean, mine warfare up in these high peaks. I mean, again, kind of how was that possible? And I mean, you mentioned it literally changed the landscape up there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they quickly realised that in a vertical situation, so one of the famous places, Lagazoy Piccolo, which is a sort of vertical rock face, and the Austrians were at the top and the Italians were on a ledge halfway down. And both sides realised that the only way they were going to get rid of the others was by tunnelling inside the mountain. So you go in horizontally 30 metres and then you dig upwards through solid limestone. So they've got compressors running, they've got pneumatic drills, and they dug these enormous tunnels. The one under the Castelletto was, I think, 400 metres long. And that's quite an achievement, a 400-metre long tunnel through solid rock. But, that was pretty much the only way you're likely to dislodge the bloke above you is by drilling under him and then blowing the top off his mountain. The problem with that was that they usually just moved to the next mountain along and started all over again. So, none of these had a lasting effect. They produced a huge amount of rock and smoke and what have you, and killed quite a lot of people. But, ultimately they achieved nothing.
And I guess secondary avalanches perhaps further down as well, with a huge percussion from the explosion.
Yeah, I mean, that is, that intentional avalanches were occasionally started. Both sides learned quite quickly where it was not sensible to build a barrack. So the first winter of the war, there were a lot of problems with, avalanches wiping people out because a lieutenant from Naples isn't going to have any kind of mountain experience. So he says to his soldiers, well, build a barrack over there, little knowing that it's in an avalanche path. So the first winter was quite chaotic in that respect, but both sides learned quite quickly that, you don't build barracks in certain places. And there was a big avalanche on the Marmolada, which killed nearly 300 people. So, some of these avalanches were colossal. But can I just say at this point, White Friday, the day in which 10,000 people were allegedly killed in avalanches, it didn't happen. The day in question wasn't Friday, and only 1,800 people died on that day. So no 10,000. I had just have to get that off my chest because it's an enduring Italian front myth which is beginning to annoy me.
We're back to sources, I guess, and kind of stories and mythology of these kind of conflicts, which sadly we don't have to go very far on social media these days to kind of find popping out the woodwork.
Absolutely.
So in the section on Monte Grappa and the Piave, this is where I guess the war kind of changes. I mean, it doesn't go well for Italy, does it? Leading to Caporetto and the complete disaster of that.
Yeah, I mean, Caporetto was an entirely predictable but colossal problem for the Italians. The commander of Italian Second Army, Capello, he kept all his troops. He was told to dig in for the winter, but he kept all his troops in the front line, had no defence in depth, had no idea really how to defend. The Italians thus far had only ever attacked, so they had no defensive nous at all. And so Capello kept all his troops in the front lines, all his guns far forward. So when the Austro-German attack happened, they punched through his lines in a matter of hours and rolled up the entire Isonzo front. The Third Army to the south had to withdraw. The Fourth Army to the north had to withdraw. Everybody scrambled west and then reformed at the Piave River. But, it should never have happened. And the Austro-Hungarians had no idea it was going to happen because they didn't bring hardly any bridging crews with them. They suddenly found themselves routing the Italians, and they had no idea that they were going to need bridging teams. So it was a surprise to the Austrians. It was a surprise to the Italians. But it was a massive disaster. They lost, 300,000 men were captured or lost, and 3,000 artillery pieces. I mean, you can't afford to lose 3,000 artillery pieces.
I don't think there's that many in any army today, is there? 3,000 artillery pieces. It's staggering. Yeah, staggering losses.
They reformed on the Piave and turned to face the Austro-Germans, who then had overextended supply lines and 6,000 square miles of hostile territory, which they then had to manage. So it wasn't a great success for the Austro-Hungarians either.
I mean, you mentioned the Germans there. I mean, Rommel was one of those who was in this theatre of war by this stage.
Yeah. Rommel earned his reputation at Caporetto, really. He gets all the plaudits, but his boss, Colonel Sprosser, really deserves them, because without Sprosser's okay, Rommel would have been tail-end Charlie. But Sprosser said, yeah, go for it. You've infiltrated the Italian third line. Now just go like hell, get as far as you can. And yeah, Rommel captured 20,000 men and thousands of machine guns, and he was given the okay by his boss. But they both got the Blue Max as a result. So it was an incredible feat of arms. I don't think anything in the First World War really came close to it in terms of speed of manoeuvre, effectiveness. They marched for a month, and incredible.
I mean, breakthrough happens in the First World War, but to exploit a breakthrough on that scale is unprecedented.
Yeah. No, it was everything it should have been, and it's extraordinary that it took that long for that to arrive on the Italian front. Really, up till that point, it had been frontal assaults, wave after wave of troops. Except for one battle, the battle for Monte Sabatino, which had infiltration tactics, it had all arms tactics. It was extraordinary, and it was incredibly successful. The Italians took Sabatino in an hour, but they didn't learn anything from it. They just went back to the same old head-on attacks. And you think, surely somebody somewhere would have looked at what happened and thought, well, that was a success. Maybe we should do that again. But no.
And that disaster at Caporetto led to the arrival of allies of Italy, including the British armed forces coming to Italy on that Piave front, including your grandfather, I guess. Yep. So this is a part of the battle where we do begin to see a kind of British and Commonwealth connection to it.
Yeah, the 5 British divisions and 3 French divisions were dispatched once once it was clear Caporetto was really unraveling. And so this, yeah, 5 British divisions, 3 French divisions ended up in northern Italy, and just their very presence was enough to frighten the hell out of the Austrians, it surprised me, I have to say, when I read the Austrian accounts. They were absolutely terrified of coming up against battle-ready French and British divisions, because they knew that they were on a slightly different level to the Italians they'd been fighting up till then. So yeah, eventually 2 British divisions went back, and we had the 7th and the 23rd divisions on the Piave and the 48th division on the Altipiano. That's where my grandfather was. And they fought one major battle in June of 1918 called the Battle of the Solstice, where it was Austria's last throw of the dice. Embarrassingly for the British, they managed to get into the front lines of the 48th Division. We threw them out pretty quickly, but it was embarrassing for the higher-ups, who sent Fanshawe home in disgrace rather unfairly. But the British spearheaded the Battle of Vittorio Veneto in October 1918, and during that battle we were supposed to be supporting the Italian advance, but the Italians didn't manage to get across the river, so the British 7th and 23rd got over the River Piave and basically caused the entire Austrian army to collapse, and they signed an armistice on the 4th of November. Well, actually, no, they signed up on the 3rd, and it went into effect on the 4th.
And that brought that conflict in Italy to an end. And there are Commonwealth cemeteries in Italy.
There's some really lovely ones. There's one on the Montello. There are a couple of others. There are some on the Altipiano. Yeah, it was a relatively easy time for the British, I have to say. You know, my grandfather, he spent most of his time playing football, knackered his cruciate ligament. But he fell in love, as a lot of British soldiers did, he fell in love with Italy. He could not believe mostly the women he fell in love with. But he stayed there until April 1919. I suspect he prolonged his stay as long as he possibly could. But he then had his honeymoon in the Dolomites. He took my grandmother to Italy multiple occasions. And the kind of love affair with Italy started with him, but it's still going. My sons, we all go to Italy every summer. Yeah, Italophiles, all of us.
Well, not a bad thing at all. Not a bad thing at all. But those small British cemeteries, I guess, are nothing really compared to the size of the cemeteries of the other nations that fought for most of the war in Italy.
No, absolutely. I mean, you know, the one at Giavira is, I think it's got 400 headstones there, something like that. You go to Redapulia, where the Italians buried their dead from the Carso, and there are 100,000 bodies in that ossuary. They have huge ones on the Izonzo. There's Oslavia, which has got 60,000. So yeah, after the war, the Italians cleared all the battlefield cemeteries and erected these rather grim fascist memorials, which a lot of people don't like. I mean, I don't like what they stand for, but they are, you know, if you see a memorial with 100,000 people in it, it's like Duomo, isn't it? Similar sort of thing.
It's an indication of the scale of it, I guess, really, and the brutality.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the things I kind of got from your book, there's a quote where it says, the war in Italy went to places no one thought possible, where men achieved the seemingly impossible, which kind of summed up what I'd read in all those chapters of your book and your incredible journey. What has writing this book really taught you, do you think, about the First World War?
Just how determined mankind is to kill each other. You know, to go to those heights, to go to those lengths, to solve those problems. And, you know, I always come back to the thought that, you know, if we put all that effort to good use, we could, as a species, do amazing things. But I suppose the other thing it taught me, I read a lot of books by a German historian called Robert Striffler, who is a very rare World War One historian who sets out all the different bits of information that he finds in all of the archives, and then he analyzes them, because there is no definitive account. You know, if you go to the Western Front, we know the definitive account of the Battle of the Somme. There's no doubt about what happened and when. But there is a huge amount of doubt on the Italian front because it hasn't been studied to that level. And Striffler did a brilliant job of, you know, looking through the evidence and then coming up with a considered most likely scenario, while still acknowledging that we can't know 100% about an awful lot of this stuff. And so much of the stuff on the Italian front is post-war fascist mythology. You know, there are these stories that abound, and I still get told off by my Italian friends for exploding fondly held myths. You know, there's a famous one of the Sardinian grenadiers who ran out of ammunition, so they each grabbed an enemy soldier and threw themselves off the mountain. You know, rubbish, absolute rubbish. There's not a single reliable eyewitness account of this. So, you know, there are these fondly held myths that persist on the Italian front, and I've been very mean to the Italians and exploded a few of them. But yeah, it's hard. It's hard to get to the definitive story, and that's, I suppose, the major takeaway from researching the Italian front. I mean, it's absurd when you think about it. You know, we know so much about other theatres of this war, and yet we know so little. In terms of vigorous academic research, there's been so little. You know, my book is not an academic book. It never set out to be. I didn't want it to be. And I don't think it could ever have been, because I would never have the skills, the knowledge, the time to actually do the research. There's so much yet to do.
But yet the book, I think, draws you into quite a complex war, and you explain it in a very good way, and you highlight all these problems as well, which I think is, you know, it takes what you've written. It's not just a guidebook. It's much, much more than that, which I think is its strength.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I set out to write the book that I wanted to read when I first went to Italy. You know, I could not find anything really that suited my purposes. I should probably mention the QR code thing in it as well. For those of you that don't know, each chapter has a QR code print at the beginning. If you scan that with your tablet or your smartphone, it will open a gallery of photos and maps that relate to that chapter. So, you know, the holy grail, I think, for a lot of military history readers is more maps, more photos. The map budget for my book was nil, so I did them all myself. And I enjoy doing that. And it's actually quite a good way of doing it, because then I get to put all the things on my map that I want on my map. So there's all this extra content that you can view online. You don't have to use a smartphone or a tablet. If you go to the website, you can look at the pictures on your computer. But I wanted to give people more pictures because it's such a visual treat. You know, describing Dolomites is really quite hard. Historians are not necessarily terribly good at descriptive writing. And so I wanted people to be able to see with their own eyes, you know, exactly how vertical this vertical wall was.
And the photographs are absolutely stunning. I mean, to me, that again was another strength of the book, because you're an incredibly talented photographer and you've captured that landscape very, very well, I thought.
It was really hard to take a duff picture when you were up there. I mean, it has to be said. You know, the Dolomites and the Ortles, all that ice and snow, you know, it lends itself to stunning photography.
And just to end with, you know, you've kind of gone on this historical journey across northern Italy, following the traces of the First World War, but it's a personal journey as well. So, what do you think it's taught you about yourself, I guess, as much as the history of the Great War?
It's confirmed that I am an idiot. I think that's pretty much, you know, I mean, this has been such a labour of love because, as you know, there's almost no money to be made from publishing military history books. And to devote 7 years of your life and go to Italy 12 times, that was not a cheap thing to do. Um, so it taught me that, yeah, I'm not doing this because I want to make money. Doing this because I loved doing it. And, I love mountains. I love Italy. I love the outdoors. And I've been there with my family. My kids have come with me climbing and cycling. My wife does a lot of hiking with me to go to these battlefields. And as long as there's a decent refugio for lunch, she's happy with that. So it's taught me the value of actually having adventures with your family if you can. I'm very lucky that I have been able to do that. And as I said before, the sort of disconnect, I think the weirdest thing was the disconnect between the joy and the beauty and the misery and the suffering. You're standing in a place where people died, where people were having just the most appalling time of their lives. And you've got a huge grin on your face and you're going, selfie for the Instagram. So it's unsettling. I found that very unsettling, and I still find it slightly unsettling because I feel that I should be more somber, I suppose.
I was going to say, I guess that a lot of these landscapes of the First World War, they make us reflect, on ourselves, and as well as the kind of past, and perhaps we reflect more once we're back from them, and we look back on that experience and perhaps connect it to what we find in the pages of accounts, histories, whatever, and it means something else more, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. I think, going there and being there is fantastic, and to be able to sort of dovetail that with the personal accounts. In some ways, I think in the Italian front, because it's generally small groups of men, it's a very intimate kind of a war, and I think that makes it very different from what we're used to. When I read about the Western Front, it's red battalions and battalions of people. Whereas these guys, they're climbing up and over to try and raid somebody else's barrack, and there are only 8 people involved. So that sort of micro aspect, I can find the humanity in it far easier than I can in large scale battles, I suppose. Yeah. And there is a humanity to it, which is encouraging. Despite all of that misery and suffering, there are people doing decent things.
Well, Tom, I mean, thank you for a fantastic book. Thanks for a fascinating chat this evening for the podcast. Your book, Thunder in the Mountains, is out now. We'll put links to it in the show notes and the podcast website. I would thoroughly recommend it. It's published by Helion, and it's a quality book on every kind of level from my point of view, particularly with the maps, which, as you've suggested, is kind of essential really to understanding these places. So what's next for you? Another journey?
Yeah, obviously. Balkans next. I'm interested in the great retreat from Serbia across the Albanian Alps to the Adriatic Sea, where the entire Serbian army and most of the population of Serbia just got up and left in October 1915. And I want to tell the story of some of the people involved in that retreat, because something like 400,000 people started, and I think 230,000 died en route from cold and starvation. So it was this, what they call a Golgotha. It was this extraordinary movement of people caused by the Austro-Hungarian and German and Bulgarian invasion. And there were a lot of British nurses and British doctors. There were some British Royal Marines involved, French flyers, all sorts of people were involved. And it was a sort of mad scramble through the snow. So I want to tell that story through the eyes of probably 6 or 8 of those participants, because it's an astonishing story. I mean, yeah, I find it absolutely staggering. And it's virtually unknown nowadays. At the time, a lot of those doctors and nurses wrote memoirs, and those are still around, but nobody's given it any attention since then. So, and I like an untold story. If I can find a story that's not familiar, but it's worth telling, then I'm a happy bunny.
Well, Tom, we look forward to that one, and look forward to a chat on the podcast about the next book.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a real joy.
My pleasure, and thanks for joining us. Thanks, Tom.
Bye.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.